We'll see whether you enjoy the moments you've been waiting for or not. Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Boy, you really can't see anything out there, can you? I'd like to thank Senator Daines, Nathan Adams, the folks with the Montana Petroleum Association, and David Galt for the opportunity to be here. Somebody asked the question earlier, which was really a good question. Is the market driving the policy, or is the policy driving the market? That tension is going to be at the core of a lot of what I talk about here. So it'll be interesting to kind of come back to that a little bit later. I've been asked to talk about the state of the natural gas and petroleum markets. I can describe it real simply. It's quite depressed. But the question is, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What does it mean to Montana? What does it mean to the country as a whole? What are the opportunities embedded in it? What are the risks? My company, Ponderosa Advisors, and I are known as data guys. We advise investment folks on the producers, midstream players, utilities, end users, pretty much everybody that is trying to put money into the oil and gas, primarily sectors. We use as much detailed, high-resolution data as we can find, because we think if you look at the real data, the bottom-level data, you can usually come up with a little better policy, a little bit better investment decision, and it's the right way to think about things. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to address, see if I can get my slides up here. Yeah, I'm going to address what I believe are four things. One is why oil and gas prices are where they are, how the two commodities interact, where my firm believes the two commodity prices are headed, and most importantly, what are the most important implications of the outlook. This is a simplified, summarized version. I'm going to have a breakout session later on this afternoon where I'll go into more detail and the logic behind it. I'm going to keep these comments at a relatively high level. The punchline, this is what I want you to remember when you clear out of the room and everybody's kind of contemplating on what you heard today. These are the points that I really want to drive home. First is that the world is moving into a period of hydrocarbon abundance from where we've been hydrocarbon scarcity. How many times in the last 35 years have you heard somebody mention things like we're running out of oil, we're running out of natural gas? Think about the investments and policy decisions that have been made, predicted on the belief that we're running out of one of those two commodities. Today, we have more hydrocarbons than we can consume. The implications are profound. First, there's a very strong probability that prices are going to remain flat or relatively low. If they rise, it'll be very slowly. High prices are not going to bail out bad decisions. That's been the case for many years. It's not going to be the case in the future. Second, oil and gas industry is going through its own period of what the Austrian economist, political scientist called creative destruction. That's the process by which technology and the market events break down traditional ways of operating an industry and create much more efficient and productive industries in their stead. After a decade of extreme capital availability, almost unimaginable technological innovation, and the hard work, the industry now recognizes it can produce more natural gas and oil than it ever fathomed it could. Today we understand the concepts of peak oil and peak gas have been obliterated. Now the industry has to restructure itself in a much smaller, more efficient, more efficient industry, and that process will transpire over the next few years, and a different industry will emerge on the backside. The third point is that the impact is going to affect governments, and it's going to affect regions of the country differently. I'm a Rockies guy. This is kind of a personal deal to me. Here we operate at a cost disadvantage to the rest of the market. We have geological factors, we have distance from the markets, and then we operate a lot on federal lands, which imposes a different kind of regulatory structure on the parties. That disadvantage may mean that as prices start to rise and the industry gets stronger, that the benefits of oil and gas development may not come to the Rockies at the same degree that they have in the past. Smaller, more efficient industry and lower commodity prices means lower tax revenues for states, counties, and even the federal government. Let's start looking at some of the data. This graph shows the essence of why oil prices are low. Remember your Economics 101 class. More supply than demand means prices fall, and until supply falls or demand rises to consume the excess supply. Quarterly supply and demand, shown here by the red bars, has a differential, the net between supply and demand. A positive imbalance means too much supply, a negative too little. The blue line depicts the average West Texas intermediate price, WTI, for each quarter. Supply exceeded demand in January 2014. By the summer of 2014, the difference was significant enough so the market started to discount the price of crude, and the balance from there has risen steadily. U.S. crude production growth is the culprit. Since 2012, production in the United States and Canada has grown by an average of 22% a year. OPEC, on the other hand, has grown by a little over 5%. Russia by 2.5%, Brazil a little less than 4%, China by 1%, and Mexico's flat. In short, supply has risen because of the U.S. and Canada, but that really means the U.S. because the U.S. produces 3 times what we do in Canada. As our production grew, it pushed imports out. Our non-Canadian imports have dropped by some 1.9 million barrels a day since 2012. It is not so, if the crude isn't sold to the United States, it goes into the global market. Crude denied a market in the U.S. is added to the volumes available for customers around the world. The trouble is that while the supply pool is growing, that demand is growing less slowly, and the imbalance across the world is growing. When you have supply growing at a faster pace than demand, eventually the imbalance becomes problematic. You get low prices. Now we're at a point where low prices will persist until either supply rises or demand increases. Let's look at the U.S. This graph shows on the top graph shows U.S. crude and natural gas production since 2012. U.S. crude production, the red bars, grew steadily until April of last year, when it peaked at its historic high of 9.7 million barrels a day. In February of this year, natural gas production peaked at 73.3 BCF a day. That's also an historic high. What's most impressive and counterintuitive about this is that while production was either holding flat or increasing, the rig count cratered. Since January 15, oil production has declined by only about 114,000 barrels. But gas production has actually grown by 1.6 billion cubic feet, and meanwhile the rig count dropped off 68%. The U.S. is producing more incremental crude and natural gas per rig than at any time in history, and I would bet any place else in the world. Because innovation, new technologies, and new business processes are driving this productivity change, horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracture stimulation, fracking as you know it, improved drill bit technologies, geosteering, multi-pad wells, and nanotechnologies are all examples of innovations that have changed the industry. The result, increased production and increased labor and capital productivity. So where do we go from here? Here's where the market gets interesting. I studied the natural gas and oil markets for 30 years. The supply-demand boom-bust has been a dominant feature of that period. That is, until about 5 years ago. Here's an illustration of the natural gas production, the blue line, and natural gas prices, the red line, since the 1990s, mid-1990s. Historically, when supply starts to fall, prices rise until a point is reached where the market thinks supply is adequate, then prices fall. As prices fall, it pressures profits, and ultimately supply begins to drop. At some point, the market perceives that there is an inadequate supply, and again, prices rise. This cycle has been repeated over and over since the 1970s. But this time is different. Look at what happened when prices fell and continued to decline starting in 2009. Instead of supply falling, it has exploded upwards, exactly the opposite of what has historically happened. What's going on? Why the change? First, there are some simple factors. You have things like drilling, where companies have to hurry up and drill wells in order to hold leases. In other cases, they have contractual commitment to drilling companies and service companies. But the third and by far the most important factor is the reintegration of oil, natural gas, and NGLs in production economics. The U.S. has always produced a lot of associated natural gas, which means that natural gas and oil simultaneously come from the same well. In the 2000s, it was believed the U.S. was running out of economically viable reserves, thus exploration attention turned to natural gas. By 2005 or so, few producers were targeting oil. Most were chasing natural gas reserve, which they believed were also running low, but the production horizon was longer. So instead, they went after NGLs, which are ethane, butane, propane, isobutane, and natural gasoline were produced as a byproduct. Producers searched for natural gas and got NGLs as icing on the cake. Slowly beginning in about 2009, this relationship changed. As producers were increasing their production of natural gas, they started producing increasing volumes of NGLs, ethane and propane in particular. While the price of natural gas fell during the period from 2009 to 12, the price of NGLs remained strong but fluctuated somewhat. This enabled producers to offset their weak natural gas revenues with strong NGL revenues. As a result, despite low natural gas prices, producers continued to drill and production continued to rise. So what happened to the NGL market? Here's a graph of ethane production and prices since 2005. It has a similar look. From 2008 to 2012, ethane prices fluctuated but were relatively high. Then they began to fall. Why? The same process that happened in the natural gas industry, just a different commodity. Because ethane production began to exceed our ability to consume. Thus, by 2013, the price reached extreme lows and has remained relatively flat since. As was the case with natural gas, NGL production outstripped our consumptive capability and prices remain low. We've talked about the integration of oil or of gas and NGLs. Crude joined the party in 2013. By then, producers had discovered that they could adapt the same fracking techniques and horizontal drilling used to produce natural gas to also produce oil. The Bakken was one of the most significant test tubes in this respect. By 2014, oil revenues were supplementing gas revenues, and in some cases NGL revenues, to drive exploration and natural gas production to new heights, even though natural gas and NGL prices remained low. As happened with natural gas and NGLs earlier, eventually too much oil drove crude prices down, and we had the trifecta. All prices were depressed. As a result, last year, the impetus to explore went into hibernation. Historically, these periods of low prices have resulted in demand growth, which consumed the supply excess and drove prices up. This time, a weak economy in the US and globally is slowing demand growth for oil. Last year, despite the cheapest oil in decades, global demand only increased a few 100,000 barrels. Until the fourth quarter of 14 or 15, and then it actually declined. Until the global economy improves, it's unlikely that oil demand will rise sufficiently to drive prices higher. That means supply has to fall, and as we all see, supply is not really falling that radically. For natural gas and NGLs, the story is a little bit different than oil. For these commodities, the markets are more domestic, though exports will become more significant. And that's not just oil for exports of natural gas, it's also NGLs, ethane, propane, et cetera, and oil. Nevertheless, through at least 2030, we have more productive and consumption capacity in the US, even including exports. To illustrate, let's look at Ponderosa's natural gas supply and demand outlook through 2030. This graph depicts our estimate of natural gas demand in blue and exports in yellow. On an annual basis, we believe that the total natural gas demand could grow to 97 BCF a day in 2025 and over 100 BCF a day by 2030 from less than 83 BCF a day today. This growth includes about 12 BCF of incremental power, about 7 BCF a day of LNG exports. We export very little. Well, today we export a little bit. Last year at this time, we didn't export any. And a little more than 4 BCF a day of industrial increased demand. While this projection is in line with industry projections, such as the MPC and EIA, I believe it's a little bit too bullish. Frankly, I don't believe the economy is strong enough to support this level of growth. Nevertheless, we'll use it as a means to illustrate our ability to provide the needed supply at a relatively low price. Before we look at supply scenarios, I want to remind you that oil and gas are linked. When we produce less oil, we get less gas. When we produce more oil, we get more gas. As this dynamic is against that dynamic, here are the what ifs. The first line shows what happens if we keep prices approximately where they are. In other words, $40 crude and $2.85, the last year's average price for natural gas. You can see in the short term and the long term, under this scenario, natural gas supply growth does not keep pace with expected demand, and that's going to drive prices higher. If you add different price scenarios, you get a little different result. If crude prices rise to $50 and gas prices to $4, the situation is better, but still gas prices must rise further to meet total demand at $50 crude. At an average price of $60 for crude and $4 gas, you can get closer. But again, there's still a shortfall. It really takes something in the neighborhood of $4.50 gas and a crude price of $75 to clear the market. So the conclusion to be drawn is that even in a very strong natural gas demand growth scenario, the U.S. can balance its market while keeping gas prices at less than $4.50. I wanted to mention, there was Mr. Marshall's presentation about coal. One of the interesting things here at $4.50, natural gas and coal don't compete, particularly Powder River Basin coal. Powder River Basin coal, for gas to compete in most parts of the country, it takes about $1.80 to $2.20, somewhere in there, natural gas can displace coal. At these prices, you're going to see a stronger demand for coal than I think people are thinking about as a general rule today. There are several caveats to my forecast here. First is it takes an average price of $4.50 to meet a very strong demand scenario. If demand grows more slowly, which I believe is more probable, lower prices will suffice, probably between $3.50 and $4.25. It does not take $4.50 to meet that market, and if you get crude prices are really the most important variable. Higher crude prices, $70 to $75, drives more gas. Second point is that technology and productivity improvements are not factored into these supply scenarios. This is a major limitation, and one cannot understate the impact that innovation is having on the industry and its ability to adapt to low prices. The comments made earlier by Karen were really quite on target there, I thought. For example, between 2012 and 2015, Continental Resources, who's a big Bakken producer, has reduced its average well, when they initiate the drill bit or drilling process, to total depth by over 4 days, and its average completion time has been reduced by 3 days. Given that the average all-in drilling cost is about $75,000 a day, that means that Continental has seen something in the neighborhood of about $300,000 savings per well. That's about somewhere 2 to 5%, depending upon the individual well. At the same time, Continental also reports that their completion costs have declined by 52% since the fourth quarter of 2014. The decline results from better prices from service companies, for sure. That's an important one. But and also it comes about because they're drilling more productive areas. But there's also technological and management innovations in the process too. Continental reports that by experimenting with their fracking, with different kinds of fracking fluids, they've been able to increase the reported ultimate recovery of their wells by some 35 to 40% over the past 2 years. These types of cost reductions, even if they're produced at even if they proceed at a slower pace, are going to bring the cost, the break-even cost of a well down over the next 5 to 10 years. I use Continental as an example, but you can go to just about any independent producer in the country, look at their annual report, and you'll find the same kind of discussion. Finally, I want to point out that you can't assume that where energy was produced yesterday will be where it's produced tomorrow. Competitive advantage will play a stronger role shaping the future market. To illustrate, look at the natural gas industry. In 2010, the Rockies produced about 25% of the total U.S. production, and everybody's expectation was that Rockies' share would increase over time. Note that the entire Appalachia area accounted for about 4% of the total country's total production, and the Utica or Marcellus area is less than 1%. This was in 2010, 5 years ago. In the average price differential between southern Wyoming and Ohio was about $3.10, which means all producers in the Rockies wanted to get their gas to Ohio as quickly as possible in order to capture some of that rent. Billions of dollars were invested with the intent of making that market transaction transpire. Think REX, Rockies Express Pipeline, Bison up in the Bakken. There are a number of them out there. Unfortunately for those investors, in five years, the world looked radically different because of the emergence of the Utica and Marcellus in what used to be dismissed as a marginal gas production region. In 2015, last year, remember it was less than 1% in 2010. In 2015, Appalachia accounted for 20% of total U.S. production, and the Rockies only 16%. The average Wyoming-Ohio differential had shrunk to 18 cents. In this year so far, it's 10 cents. It costs about 25 cents to move gas on an interruptible basis from Cheyenne to Ohio, so that the price differential now doesn't even cover the spread or the transportation costs. By 2020, it will look even more extremely different. Ponderosa estimates that in 2020, the Rockies will account for less than 10% of the total U.S. production, while Appalachia, primarily Utica and Marcellus, will produce over 30%. Essentially, this is the reverse of what analysts thought would be the case in 2010. By the way, we estimate that the 2020 price will be lower in Appalachia than it is in the Rockies by about 20 cents. What does that mean? That means the gas is going to have an economic motivation to move west, not east. And as a result, it's going to be very difficult for Rockies gas to move east, which is where about a third of our gas, and not quite that much, 25% of our gas now moves. Competitive advantage has become much more significant in the shaping of these productive regions. Producers, if they can get less regulation or they have less cumbersome regulations, they have a much better ability to make money. So so I want you to think for a second, how many of you have a smartphone? How many of you drove your car today? Why do you care about these things? Why should you be concerned? You should care because petroleum-derived products are an indispensable part of our daily lives. They are replaceable they are not replaceable at a reasonable cost. Due to innovations in oil and natural gas industries and the abundance it has created, the country now has lower-priced commodities with which to make these products. Without low-cost energy, our economy and your lives would be nowhere near as vibrant and prosperous as they are. It's fashionable today to say things like we should ban fracking or eliminate hydrocarbon use. They may scratch an emotional itch, but ask yourself whether they have any reasonable, or whether they even reasonable aspirations. For example, we will eliminate hydrocarbons. If we eliminate hydrocarbons, how will we build all the computers and electric vehicles, smart meters that we need to implement that vision of the future without petroleum? Banning hydrocarbon development in federal lands may sound good to some, but since many states and Indian tribes receive tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in the form of severance taxes associated with hydrocarbon development on federal lands, how will the lost revenues be offset? Which services are going to be curtailed, or are we simply going to exacerbate our debt problems? Maybe we just increases everybody's taxes. Calls to ban fracking are equally disingenuous. Since 2015, 20,000 wells were in 2015, about 20,000 wells were drilled, and at least 90% of them were fracked. If fracking is outlawed, our production of oil and natural gas will fall dramatically, and the price of refined products and the natural gas used to heat homes, power generation turbines, and the cost of derivative products such as computers, polypropylene vests, water bottles, etc., will skyrocket. How will the average consumer afford what today are affordable, commonly available goods? According to the Western Energy Alliance, in 2014, there were over 100,000 people employed in the natural gas and oil industries in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. These jobs carry relatively high salaries and drive significant secondary employment and economic activity. Since 2014, estimates suggest that 30,000 direct jobs have been lost, which among other things means income tax revenues have also been lost. Abundance and relatively low prices associated with dramatic implications or have dramatic implications for tax revenues at all government levels. Colorado is facing about a $250 million shortfall, Wyoming about $460 million, and in North Dakota, between oil, gas, and farm commodity prices, there's about $1 billion deficit. That's at the state level. In the local county level, Colorado's Weld County, northeast of Denver, about 70% of the property taxes are associated with oil and gas. If these collections will fall dramatically over the next couple of years as commodity prices decline, catch up with tax assessment processes. Counties all over the West are going to face this type of stress on their ability to pay for schools, emergency response, and other services. Whether the economies or if some or all states come back as prices rise will depend on the competitive advantage or disadvantage of the region's reserve relative to areas such as Texas, Oklahoma, and Appalachia. In the meantime, the price decline is going to put finances of the Rocky states under considerable pressure. Imagine what will happen to these economies if federal lands are declared off limit or general bans of fracking are implemented. When economic historians write the history of this time 50 years from now, I suspect that they're going to rank the increase in oil and natural gas production that has occurred in the last 10 years and the technical innovation that has spurred it among the most significant economic events of the last 100 years. Fracking, horizontal drilling, drill bit technology, evolution, and innovative management practices are transforming the industry. As a result, we have an abundance of relatively low-cost oil and natural gas to power our economy, lead a resurgence in manufacturing, and improve our quality of life. I hope our political leaders have the wisdom and restraint to allow it to happen. I know, Senator Daines, you understand these issues. I hope a number of your associates figure them out. With that, I'll take some questions for a few minutes. Oh, no, I guess I'm told no questions. Okay, I'll have I can answer questions this afternoon in the workshop.
All right, we're going to move to another great panel. And so as I'm announcing the panel, if you'd come forward, you know who you guys are. Kirk Bushman, Kurt Pohl, Carl Borgquist, Dave McClain, and Dennis Vermillion. Come on up and get seated, and let me introduce the panel. This panel is about renewables, technology, and the grid. They'll discuss the opportunities for our state to take advantage of its energy potential while identifying the challenges to increasing our all-of-the-above energy portfolio. Our moderator for this panel today will be another public service commissioner. It's Kirk Bushman. And our panelists will be Kurt Pohl, Vice President of Distribution at NorthWestern Energy, Carl Borgquist, President and CEO of Absaroka Energy, Dave McClain, Senior Director of Development for EverPower Wind Holdings, and Dennis Vermillion, Senior Vice President for Avista Corp and President of Avista Utilities. We're going to have another great panel. Please welcome Kirk Bushman and the moderator.
Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it. Well, everybody's right. You can't see much from up here, so I'll sit at the table here shortly. But first, I wanted to say welcome to the Renewables Technology and Grid panel. And thanks to Steve for putting this on. It's been a great event so far. As he said, my name's Kirk Bushman. I'm the Public Service Commissioner from District 2, which you are all in District 2, and I welcome you to it. I grew up here in Billings, so welcome to Billings as well. The Public Service Commission, we are districts, and the District 2 is the southeast 10 counties of Montana. Billings to Baker, as they say. So Colstrip, which is one of the facilities we've talked a lot about today, is in District 2, so very appropriate that we're here talking about this today. I grew up here in Billings, graduated from Montana State University with a mechanical engineering technology degree. And back in the 80s, anybody who got one of those engineering degrees, the first thing you did was you moved out of state and got yourself your job. So it's really good to see a lot of this tech development happening in the state of Montana. It wasn't until about the mid-90s I was able to move back to Montana and continue in that world. Before being elected to the commission, I worked for an engineering consulting firm, and I got to go to many of these facilities we talk about in Montana, Colstrip, the refineries. I've been to the Silicon plant in Butte. I spent the 2010-11 years over on the Bakken. If those of you might remember the floods and the snow. I remember driving across from Glendive to Williston, and the DJ said on the radio, it's 30 below, and I kept waiting for him to say wind chill, and he never did. It was 30 below, so challenging times. But let me move on. We got a great panel today, and so what I'll do is I'm going to introduce our panels. I'm going to give them each a few minutes to tell you about their company and a little bit about some of the challenges they're dealing with, and then we'll ask some questions of them, and I encourage the audience to participate as well. So first up I'm going to go to is Dave McClain. Dave is the Senior Director of Development for EverPower Holdings. Dave, go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Okay, EverPower is a small wind company. We're not very big. We're 750 megawatts of installed capacity, mostly in the East Coast, in the Marcellus area, by the way, in New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia. We have one big project in California. We have a lot of developing projects in the West, in Montana, Oregon, Washington, Utah. We're also in Maine and Ohio. We represent about a $1.2 billion investment in wind since 2009, and we're making pretty good money at it. What I want to talk to you about, it's all about the market. The market is in a transition right now between state policies, national policies, policymakers, customers, utilities. It's a great sea that's swimming in a whirlpool of market that we really don't have good clarity on. You have customers coming to utilities such as Microsoft, Walmart, Mars Candy Bars, for God's sakes, Google, Dow, the U.S. Department of Defense, all saying we want a larger renewable portfolio. You have ratepayers, you have voters making decisions. You have political players going along. All the governors of all the Northwest states are moving in policy directions that are influencing and radically changing the market. That includes Governor Brown in California. But one of the people that hasn't been spoken about who's really changing the market around here is Warren Buffett. Pacific Corp is owned by Mid-American. Rocky Mountain Power is owned by Mid-American. Nevada Power is owned by Mid-American. That company is changing the market. It is changing it because it's building transmission. It's building Gateway North, Gateway South. It's reinforcing its system from Wyoming into California. It is going to enter into the California Independent Systems Operator. It's going to be part of the energy imbalance market. It's changing the electrical world as we know it. And at the same time, coal is in decline. We have Boardman, Oregon, going to retire by 2022, retiring and converting to gas. 550 megawatts. Centralia, Washington, 1,340 megawatts, retiring by 2025, converting to gas. Colstrip, 2,030 megawatts, sometime between now and 2040, something else is going to be there. It's going to be partially coal, probably partially gas. All of these things are changing the market. So what about Montana? Montana has 665 megawatts of capacity installed in wind, but it has a wind resource potential that the U.S. Department of Energy says is 944,000 megawatts. They say that 200,000 megawatts are readily achievable with today's technology. That means if you could buy the Lego set in Denmark and take it someplace in Montana and set it up, it'll make power. Now, it doesn't have transmission, and transmission is the key. So in Montana, you've got the Colstrip line and the BPA lines going west, and you've got the WAPA lines that are going east, and you've got Pacific Corp lines going south. And that's the limit on how you develop the wind energy in the state of Montana. It's all about market access, it's all about transmission to get there. There's a lot of transmission in play across the United States. They say that the Dakotas and Kansas and that belt, that's the Saudi Arabia wind. Well, Montana, with its 200,000 megawatts of available, readily achievable technology today, wind megawatts, what is it, the Kuwait of wind? I mean, it's a huge, huge resource. And just like all other resources, you should look at how you can convert it, develop it into the resource mix. Right now, Rock Island power lines being planned and developed from Kansas into Chicago. The Great Belts Express is going from southern Kansas over into Kentucky. Plains and Eastern is going from northern Texas over into Tennessee. Central and Western from northern Texas to the LA Basin. And Warren Buffett is developing Gateway North and Gateway South. The transmission market, and these are transmission lines across the United States that are being designed and developed to export wind to a market that wants more renewables. Why are we here? Well, we went out and found a couple of spots that had available transmission capacity. One is in Carbon County near Warren, where we're building a 240 megawatt project and delivering that into Pacific Corp. We're building a 10-mile power line so we can deliver it to Pacific Corp in Wyoming into their service territory. And we have another project in McClain County near Wolf Point, which is going to interconnect to WAPA. And WAPA is part of the Southwest Power Pool now, so we expect that we'll be able to sell that electricity into more higher quality or higher price markets in the Southwest Power Pool than we see in Montana. Some quick facts about Montana. You're just an energy, you're a big energy exporter. You export $1.5 billion worth of stuff, cattle, coal, minerals, grain. You are an export state. You have 7.4 billion barrels of oil out there. You have 25% of the U.S. coal reserves. And you have 30% of the Rocky Mountain refinery capacity in the state. You are an exporting state. And so the point I want to make here is that if you look at that 200,000 megawatts of wind potential and apply today's capital cost to it for a wind project, it represents over the next 40-year horizon the opportunity to build $240 trillion of new capital investments. And I don't know if we could ever get that far, but these are very big numbers. They're startling big numbers. So if you're looking at declining oil prices and declining coal opportunities in this state that affect local economies, you should also think about a balance of resources, because this resource represents a development opportunity that enriches rural communities. That's a lot of money to be spent in rural communities to help with the property tax situation. So we're going to become the largest taxpayer in Carbon County. We're going to become the largest taxpayer in McClain County, and we're proud of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, very much. And just a reminder, if you have a question, formulate that in your head. If you want to write it down and you don't want to go to a microphone, you're more than welcome to bring it up to me, and I'll definitely read your question to one of our panelists. Next up, I'd like to thank him for coming out. He is Dennis Vermillion. Dennis is the Senior Vice President of the Avista Corp and the President of the Avista Utilities. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. What I thought I would do is just take a minute to tell you all a little bit about Avista. And Bob Rowe, I don't know if Bob is still here. Raise your hand. He made me raise my hand. He must be gone. But Bob made a comment about the partnership that we've long had with NorthWestern Energy, and I just wanted to expound on that a little bit before we get started. He also mentioned a big storm that we had over the Thanksgiving weekend last year. And for those of you who don't know, Avista we're headquartered in Spokane, Washington, investor-owned utility, just like NorthWestern. And we had the largest storm event in the company's 126-year history. And it was just a remarkable effort by our own employees to kind of put things back together. We had crews from all over the West come in to help us put things back together. And NorthWestern was instrumental in dropping everything that they had going on to come to Spokane and help us restore power to our customers. We normally have about 10 crews in the Spokane area. We have 28 crews system-wide, and at the height of the restoration efforts, we had 130 line crews on our system working to put things back. So you can see it took us 10 days to get it done. So you can see it was a very big event for us, for our company. And Bob talked about the partnership and the close association that we've had between our two companies. And I just wanted to thank, Bob's not here, I'll thank Mike. Mike, thank. Bob's actually out there. Oh, he is, okay. There he is back there. So Bob, thank you for your kind words. And thank you for your partnership over the years. It means a lot to us. One thing I wanted to mention on that, by the way, one of the things we're most proud about, 130 crews, we had over 700 employees working on that. All the people that were in our company and from other companies, not one safety incident through 10 days of storm restoration working around the clock. So that is a remarkable effort, and just a true testament to the men and women that were working to put things back. So that's that. What I would like to do is maybe tell you a little bit about our company. You may think that we're a bit of an outsider of Montana, but we are not. And Bob, I'm going to pick on you a little bit here if I can. My boss, Bob mentioned him, Scott Morris, chairman and CEO of Avista Corp. I kid him a lot because when we have these speaking engagements, oftentimes he goes first and then he says everything that I was going to say. And Bob, you kind of covered some of the things that I was going to say. So it must be a CEO thing. I don't know. Does that happen to you a lot, Mike?
It does.
It does, yes. But all kidding aside, we have been in the state of Montana for over 50 years with our Noxon Rapids hydro facility. Noxon is 562 megawatts of generating capacity, so it's by far our largest hydro plant on our system. It is the crown jewel, the backbone of our system. And we recently completed a complete mechanical and electrical overhaul of all the units at that facility. It's been operating over 50 years, and now it's set up to operate for another 50 years going forward. So that is something that very valuable to us, needless to say. As we also know, we have a 15% increase or share of coal strip units 3 and 4, so that's 222 megawatts of capacity. And we've talked a lot about coal in Montana and the coal strip facility in particular. Very low cost, very reliable resource for our customers. Been a big benefit to our customers for a number of years. So when you add up the coal strip and the Noxon Rapids facility, we have about 40% of our total company-owned generation is located in the state of Montana. Now, we don't have any retail customers here, but for a precious few, we have some company housing at the Noxon Rapids facility, so about 20 of our employees. But other than that, our customer base is North Idaho and Eastern Washington. So when you total that up, we have more generating capacity in Montana than Talon. Of course, we also own a proportionate share of the coal strip transmission system. And and it doesn't stop there. Our commitment to renewables over the, throughout our history has been one that's evident in our hydro system. In total, we have over 50% of our generating capacity is hydro. We were the first utility in the country back in 1984 to develop a utility-scale biomass facility. It's a 50-megawatt facility in Colville or Kettle Falls, Washington. Still operating today, very reliable and useful plant for our customers. And then wind. We recently acquired the rights to a 105-megawatt wind project that's south of Spokane, and that came online in 2012. And then we've also dabbled in some solar. We have a community solar project that came online last year that is working very well for us. So add all that up, we have one of the lowest carbon footprints of investor-owned utility in the country. I think we're 5th lowest, and among the lowest rates in the country as well, so that's something that we're very proud of. So again, I'm glad to be here today, and hopefully I'll be able to add to the conversation as we go forward.
Very good. Thank you, Dennis. And I think now I'll go to our next person in other utility, and that is Mike Cashell. Mike is the Vice President of Northwest Energy's transmission. Mike.
Thank you, Commissioner Bushman. Can everyone hear me okay? Little sign here to speak closely to the microphone, so I'll try to do that. Just a couple of things that I'd want to open up with. First of all, you've heard from Kirk, who's our Vice President of Distribution, and also from Bob, talking about our infrastructure, and also John Hines on supply. What I want to touch on is what we do with our transmission system. And many people might not know this, but from a transmission perspective, we have a system that ranges from 50,000 volts to 500,000 volts and everything in between. And it's very large. Coal strip transmission system, of which we are also a proportionate owner, makes it fairly unique. So what we do from a transmission perspective is serve several classes of customers. First, we serve our retail customers, of which the Montana Public Service Commission sets the rates for our bundled service to them. Then we also serve, you've heard our discussion around choice customers, or the large industrial customers in Montana that during deregulation went to a different supplier. We deliver their energy to them through our system. And then we also do the same for the many cooperatives in the state, Western Montana G&T and Central Montana Cooperative, Southern Montana Electric Cooperative. We deliver their power to them over our transmission system. And then as a result of FERC regulation that occurred in the late 1990s, we also have what's called an open access transmission system. And we provide service to a series of customers there as well. Small generators, larger independent generators. For example, Dennis mentioned Talon Energy, which is an owner in Colstrip, former owner of the Correct plant. We provide transmission services to customers like that. And then really importantly, and a topic of this panel, we do provide interconnection and transmission services to other independent generation facilities that have more recently come on the picture, on the scene, and that is wind developers that have wind projects in the state and others, small hydro facilities, those sorts of things. And we have a large interconnection queue, if you will, on our transmission system, again required under FERC regulation, and we provide this interconnection service. And one thing I want to touch on as we talk about this renewable panel, and hopefully there'll be some questions around this as well, is kind of the boom and bust we've seen with regard to renewable development on our system. I go back to 2008, and in our interconnection queue, and keep in mind, in the 2008 timeframe, including Colstrip, there was about 3,000 megawatts of generation interconnected to our transmission system. But around 2008, there was a lot of development going on in the state, and we had over 3,000 megawatts of wind development at one form or another, one stage or another in our interconnection queue. Now, we've interconnected several of those facilities, but the trend has dropped off for different reasons. Dave touched on the importance of a market, and I think we're really seeing that as a transmission provider. While there's hundreds of thousands of megawatts worth of potential for wind development in Montana, there's got to be a market for it. And Montana itself, those projects that have come on the system are generally smaller in nature, and they've been delivered through qualifying facilities and federal law through PURPA. They've been delivered primarily to NorthWestern's energy supply group. So there's this large potential market, but I think the secret sauce and the key is what market is this potential wind generation facility going to serve, or all the potential facilities. That's a real challenge, and I think folks like Dave are working hard to crack that nut. The other thing we're seeing a lot of recently is potential solar development, and that's taking a little bit different flavor on our system. It's typically very much smaller facilities, around 3 megawatts, and again, I would say tailored toward the qualifying facilities, regulations and laws. And the other difference is that most of these facilities are looking to locate on our distribution system. So that's causing us to think and scratch our head a little bit about how we're going to integrate those type of systems into our distribution and transmission system. And with that, Commissioner Bushman, I think I'll wait for additional questions.
Very good. Well, that brings us to our next panelist. He's got some interesting projects to tell us about. That's Carl Borgquist. Carl is the president and CEO of Absaroka Energy. Carl?
Thank you, Commissioner, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you. I run a little company in Bozeman, Montana that's working on a couple of projects, one of which I want to tell you about, or you may have heard about, is the Gordon Butte Pump Storage Facility. We are in the middle of a FERC licensing process on that project. We filed our final license application last year, which was accepted without deficiency, and we're hoping to see the license on that project at some point towards the end of the year. This is a closed-loop pump storage facility. What I mean by that is we're not intersected into any wetland or waterway. These are two brand-new reservoirs that will be built at the bottom and top of Gordon Butte. It's about 1,000 feet of elevation gain between those two, and that's what creates the kind of magic for this site. We're able to construct this site pretty simply because we don't have to develop a large penstock to hook the two together. So this pump storage facility will be interconnected into the coal strip line on the 71 ranch behind the project. That's about 5.5 miles of transmission. All of this is covered under our FERC license. This is not your father's pump storage facility. Pump storage projects in the United States were built 25, 30, 35, 40 years ago, really to pair with large nuclear and coal facilities, so there was an on-peak, off-peak opportunity to put those electrons to use that were produced at night. So the equipment had essentially two mode changes. At night, it would pump, and during the day, it would be stopped and switched and switched to generate. This new equipment basically turns the same direction all of the time. And so what that allows us to do is go from pumping to generating in seconds. In fact, the facility can go 40 megawatts a second in either direction. So why did we pick that equipment, which, by the way, is the most expensive pump storage equipment we could pick? We wanted to produce a tool that could backstop what we saw as an emerging variable market with need for very quick integration of all sorts of issues on the grid, not just renewables, but there are increasing environmental constraints and management of transmission, what transmission we have, that a facility like this can assist. Commissioner Bushman asked me to asked us to comment on the challenges that we see going forward, and for my project and for what we're seeing, this storage issue is kind of a new discussion we're having as the grid is evolving and the generation fleet is evolving. The market for that is not resolved as it is for other types of facilities. You know, in the past, we used to look at load growth. We would build a generation facility. We would tie that together with the transmission line. It was pretty linear. As you can tell, listening to the folks at this conference, this issue is getting more complicated by the day. So this tool is really coming of age, we think, at a time when the grid is going to need this ability for something to backstop and keep reliable all this different and disparate generation and issues that are going on. With that, I'm anxious to make myself available for your questions.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for all of you being here today, and I think we'll just dive into the topic of discussion, which is renewables, and how are we going to integrate them in light of the transition of the grid that's taking place. We've heard from a lot of panelists about the changing gas prices. I think one thing I've heard in a number of venues is the Clean Power Plan, although it's questionable right now, there is a transition to natural gas because of pricing and those types of things. So I'll pose the question to the two utilities first, is in light of, many people here I think are aware of like the renewable portfolio standards and some of the requirements placed upon you to participate with renewables. And so if you could speak to where you're at, what those mandates are, whether they're federal, state mandates, and where you're at, if you're meeting them or if you're going to have challenges with meeting them, and then perhaps what some of the lessons learned while you integrated or brought on some of those renewables. And Mike, I'll just start with you, and then we'll go to Dennis.
Okay, thank you. So John Hines probably would have more information right at the tip of his fingers regarding the renewable portfolio standards. I know generally what they are. We have a 15% standard by 2015 that we have met in terms of our renewable portfolio standard. We also have a community renewable energy portfolio program that we're struggling a little bit in order to get projects that meet that particular rule. But at the present, we have around 220 megawatts worth, actually 240 megawatts worth of wind generation on our system that's renewable in nature. That's made up primarily of the Judith Gap Wind Facility, 135 megawatts, Spion Cop Facility, 40 megawatts, and then we have a host of other smaller qualifying facilities that help us meet that renewable portfolio standard. So we're not having any problems actually meeting that standard. Again, we are a little bit with what we call the CREP standard. The challenge, one of the challenges is from a transmission perspective is that integration of that resource into our system. And when I say integration, I mean that Wind is by its nature a variable resource. It's not dispatchable. So we have to have something on our system to react to the changes and the differences between the actual and forecast on the system. And the way NorthWestern presently does that is through a generation facility that we built and constructed specifically for allowing us to manage load variations and wind generation variations. That's called the Dave Gates Generation Station, and it's outside of Butte and outside of Anaconda, actually. And we've had some challenges with that. First of all, the technology, we had to make it's kind of a unique plant in order to do the kind of things that we've asked it to do. And we put it into service, of course, before we had the hydro facility, so there's potentially some ability for us to use our more integrated transmission and generation system to integrate renewables in the future. But the challenge is that the regulatory and there's physical challenges. One of the regulatory challenges we've had most recently is actually recovering the cost associated with the Dave Gates Generation Station. We requested a certain rate structure with the Montana Public Service Commission, and to the Commission's credit, we are recovering the costs that we requested associated with Dave Gates, the prudent costs. That's not the same case at the federal level. With the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we had a portion of those costs that were allocated to our federal customers. Again, those customers, the cooperatives and large industrial customers who take service from us, they also require regulation. And the result of the order that came out of the FERC on that is that we're very much under recovering the costs associated with that portion of the plant. In fact, about 20% of the costs were supposed to be associated with federal rate recovery, and we're getting about 4% from our current rates. So we're concerned on a number of fronts, but one would be if we're asked to integrate additional renewable generation for someone else, is can we actually recover the costs associated with that given our experiences at FERC? So that's one set of challenges that we've had with integration of renewables.
Very good. Dennis, your take on that?
Yeah, I would say that we're in a little bit different situation. We are we do not have a renewable portfolio standard in the state of Idaho, and in Washington we have a standard that was voted into law through the initiative process, Initiative 937, and that peaks out at 15% of our Washington load needs to be met with an eligible renewable resource by 2020, I believe it is. And we're well on our way to meeting that standard. Now that's how it sits right now. We're in pretty good shape. Of course, things could change. We have a 50% renewable portfolio standard now or obviously in California, and Oregon's headed that way too. And so there's a funny thing that kind of happens in the state of Washington. Sometimes those things migrate north, so I wouldn't be surprised if our standard changed at some point down the road. But for now, we're in very good shape. And I talked a lot about our hydro system. Mike talks about the challenges of integrating renewables, and again, we're unique in that our hydro system provides us a lot of flexibility. The Clark Fork River with Knox and Rapids and Cabinet Gorge, and then our Spokane River plants and our contractual rights to mid-Columbia generation affords us a lot of flexibility. So we have had no trouble integrating in the renewables that we brought on into our system. Now that's a finite resource, and down the road as we look to add more renewables to meet whatever standards may come our way, it could become more of a challenge like NorthWestern is facing. And in that event, you're likely to see gas-fired generation would be the way we would go to help integrate that.
Very good, thank you. And I'm going to go to Dave, and then we'll go to Carl. But Dave, I'm going to change the question up a little bit, is to say you're kind of on the other end of this. So do you feel that some of these regulatory mandates and such, the RPS standard or any of them that you'd like to talk about, have they benefited wind projects to you, the way the wind project or the wind developers would like? If there are any changes that you would like to see in some of these regulations that you think would be more beneficial to the wind developers?
Well, there's no question that the renewable portfolio standard has improved the market for renewables, because it's creating a market opportunity in that area. I think that the evolution of the market is going to go more toward competitive pricing market over the next 10 years instead of a shared allocation market. Everybody has to compete at the bus bar. I think the tax policies have benefited the renewable energy, but the American Wind Energy Association and our company believes that those tax policies should phase out over the next 5 years. So we just want consistent tax laws. We can't have the renewable energy tax law expiring every 3 years. You cannot finance or plan a project with that. You need to have consistent tax laws. And we want to have parity in the tax laws. We shouldn't be subsidizing more than another guy. We shouldn't be penalized more than the other guy. We should have parity on what's tax credits or deductions across the board. That's basically what the wind industry wants to see, is consistency and parity. Now, in terms of integration, I'd like to kind of point out that one of the advantages that Montana has on integration is that it's a winter peaking resource. And what do I mean by that? It means that the Columbia River resource, the Great Columbia River Wind Fleet, is a spring peaking resource. So it turns itself on when the wind blows, and it turns itself off when the wind stops blowing. But that all occurs during the peak hydro period. So it's directly bumping up against peak hydro when the transmission lines are all congested. So it's very difficult to move power from one side of the Cascades to the other during the peak spring period. There's not enough winter peaking wind resources into the system mix to provide some more broader market opportunities and system stability and integration opportunities. So Montana wind provides that distinct advantage in that it is a winter peaker. Right now, Colstrip is owned 64% by the Spokane, Seattle, Portland market. And that's the market that's demanding more and more resources that come from the Resource Portfolio Standard. That's the market that's going to want to see winter peaking systems. So I think we need to look more at not only transmission improvements, but transmission integration, how we do predictive modeling on the transmissions. Wind right now can predict 15 minutes ahead. It can predict an hour ahead on its generation output. It can ramp down fairly easily. It doesn't ramp up very well. It can predict basically on an annual basis what its 24/7 output, so you have the profile. And that profile then has to be married up with another resource, such as the pump hydro resource, would be perfect, or a gas resource to balance out the system. So balancing the system is very important. So the more interconnected the system becomes and the more diversified the system becomes, you think it's more difficult to balance, but actually with new instrumentation and control technologies, it's not going to be that difficult to balance. But you can only balance if you have diversity. And I think in the future mix, by the way, I think that coal has a very prominent role to play. I think there should be 25 to 35% of the resource portfolio has to be coal, provide that base load resource into the system, and then a lot of gas into that system. And I think gas is going to kind of push coal down more than wind will because of pricing more than anything else. And then the renewables in the future, by 2040, I see a renewable mix of probably 35 to 40% renewables in the general mix of the portfolios in the western United States.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to use a couple of your points, I think, segue over to Carl. And it was mentioned earlier during the Cloud Peak presentation that about the production tax credit. And his opinion was that it applied more to carbon sequestration. So I'll dovetail that into you, Carl, is your pump storage projects. I'm unaware of how your projects would benefit from many of the federal regulatory mandates. And if you could speak to that production tax credit, do you benefit from that currently, or would you like to see that expanded to your project?
We don't benefit directly. I know the National Hydro Association is trying to work on the investment tax credit applying to hydro. That would be can tell you from looking at my financial model that helps a lot. But I suppose for us, the renewable portfolio standard impacts us in the sense that the more renewables go on the system, the more variability there is, the harder it is to integrate everything. And that's, again, Pump storage is difficult to site, but it's a good large-scale tool for integrating and managing the grid. So to the extent that we're putting more wind on the system, it's just more call for us to step up and perform some duty for the grid.
Very good. A reminder to everybody, if you have questions, I think this is a good time to, we'll entertain any at this time. And I've got a few more things we can talk about, and we'll try to steer things up here a little bit in just a minute. We've heard a lot of talk about coal strip, and there are two very large transmission lines that leave the coal strip facility. And so if I could, I'd just have you all speak to if something, depending on what the future is, but if coal strip goes down, 1 and 2 are fairly older units. So if you could, give us some ideas of how you see the future playing out, whether coal strips 1 and 2 go down. If they do, how might the utilities or you as wind developers and pump storage, how would you deal with that? What are some of the things you think the challenges that would present, as well as what are the solutions you might have in mind to deal with the issues? Mike, I'll just go down the line here.
Okay, again, thank you. You know, a shutdown of coal strip is, at some point, just from an economic standpoint, is probably inevitable. What we're concerned about is an early shutdown of the facility, and John already described how that would impact our supply side of the business. From a transmission perspective, the coal strip transmission system is integrated into our overall Montana transmission system. It's a very important part of our transmission system. And in addition to kind of the physical attributes, the coal strip owners, current owners of 1, 2, 3, and 4 at coal strip, they pay for the coal strip transmission system. So we would continue to have, in the event part of the generation facility shut down, we would still have the fixed and operating costs associated with the transmission system. So we would be concerned about, you know, the continued economic viability of the system, for one. As far as other uses of the transmission system, you know, obviously to develop additional renewable resources within the state, and again, I think the market for them outside of the state is probably key to that happening. We have to have something to replace the kind of the mass and that base load characteristic of the generation that we have at coal strip. And that's likely going to be some sort of gas-fired generation facility. And John Hines, of course, alluded to the fact that we need capacity in our supply portfolio as well. There's some challenges with that outside of just saying let's develop gas generation. There's abundant gas in the United States, but actually as a company, NorthWestern is becoming quite constrained on its gas transmission system. We have finite gas reserves within the state. We have finite interconnection capability within our neighbors. So we're looking at options right now. How do we expand our gas transmission and supply capability, either through options like expanded interconnection capability or building a liquefied natural gas plant in our own footprint. The bottom line is that any continued renewable use or additional renewable use in Montana has to be supported by some additional base load generation, and that's going to cause us to think about what do we do with gas transmission infrastructure. So there's a cost associated with that. Not that it can't be done, but I think everyone should realize that there's additional infrastructure that's likely going to be necessary.
Dennis, please.
Okay, thanks. You know, I agree with Mike. Clearly in California and soon in Oregon, you know, they'll be competing with one another, I think, for wind resources across the West. But the market will be there. It's just a question, it's a long ways away. So what are the economics to be able to harvest the great wind resource that is here and ship it all the way to the load centers? Certainly there's transmission investments that are needed, as Mike points out. You lose an asset like coal strip, the rotating mass and the stability that it provides the system. It's going to require an investment in order to replace that. That adds cost. So if you look at, and then you have states like Wyoming too, which I think we ought to think about. You know, that's a very rich state also in terms of wind resource. And you know, I defer to the transmission experts, but are they in a better competitive position to get their resource to those markets than Montana? I don't know. It's something that we ought to be looking at and trying to solve. When we do our resource planning at Avista, you know, we look at what's near us first, and with I mentioned the wind project that we purchased, long-term power purchase agreement earlier. It's not as good a wind resource as you would find in Montana, but because of the proximity, it's right in our service area. The economics point towards going towards that resource. So that, I think, is really going to be the challenge. It's not that you can't get it to the load center. It's just at what cost, and what are the alternatives that the load center utilities might have that are closer to home.
Carl, if you could.
It seems like I know a guy who's working on a project with a lot of spinning mass that he wants to hook into the back of the Colstrip system. Listen, putting aside the Colstrip issue, let's assume just for a minute that the customers out in Washington and Oregon want to buy renewables. I mean, one thing that's important to realize is that price drives a lot of how we develop energy. All of you know that. And the wind capacity in Montana is significantly higher than what's in the Columbia Gorge and in Washington and Oregon. And it actually blows at the right time during the more on peak than off peak. That Columbia Gorge resource tends to blow at night. So if they want to buy renewable electrons, I've often said I want to be in a position to make sure that we can make them reliable and keep the Colstrip transmission system supported and stable because of this spinning mass of the pump storage, and put a package together that can work. So just a thought as we think if this is going to go away at some point, regardless of what the reason is, we do have a resource that's worth trying to sell and continue to export and keep those jobs and tax dollars, though they might be different here in the state.
Yeah, the real thing here is you have to, in a big planning picture, you need to start connecting the dots. If Colstrip 1 and 2 are shutting down, then there's available capacity in that transmission line, and a large portion of that capacity is owned by the utilities in the Pacific Northwest that have an increasing need for meeting portfolio standards or, policy-driven uses and customers that want it. So that's available capacity to ship to the Pacific Northwest, and those who own the transmission line have those customers. So I would see more wind going into that line as Colstrip fades back, but I also see more gas being built in the same region, and I would like to see, my personal vision is that we would have more transmission built toward the east, because that's where the big market is, and that's where the other states are doing, like South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska down, and they're looking at these large transmission line improvements to the east to bring product to the east. And it can't be just a wind resource power line. It should be a balanced line with some coal and maybe and a lot of natural gas, so that you're having a balanced product that's being sold in the market, because the most important thing we have to have is a reliable grid. I mean, those guys in Seattle that like to drive their Beamers and work on their iPhones, their reality is different. The only thing that they get focused on is when the power goes off. And they go, oh my God, what's my power running? I can't recharge my iPhone anymore. We have to have a reliable grid, and variable resources can't run the entire grid. So you have to look at a diversified portfolio. And if you're going to increase the amount of transmission capacity to meet these burgeoning markets that are outside of Montana, then look at how to do that with a balance of gas and coal and wind. That's your future. That's the Montana energy picture in the year 2040, is more transmission, more balanced output using all of its resources, so it is an exporting state.
Very good. And this will be, I think, our last question, and I'm hoping to give everybody enough time to respond to it. But here is the $1 million question, and I endeavor to say it's probably a lot more than $1 million question, but how do we pay for it all? And so let me throw a quick hypothesis out here, and you guys can tell me how crazy I am or not, but it's the engineer in me. When you see these problems, you just want to fix them. So I saw a number of fellows around the summit that were folks that were appointed to the governor's Clean Power Advisory Committee. I myself was one of those, so I got to thinking, if I was advising the governor, what would I say? And it would be my advice perhaps to say, let's convene this Clean Power Plan Advisory Committee. We'll create a state implementation plan that says to the EPA, Montana will meet the original 20% reduction of the draft rule, and in addition, we'll rebuild units 1 and 2 of Colstrip with clean coal technology, the ability to integrate wind and solar, with the capability of utilizing pump storage technology. There's a man-made lake right down in town there. I'm sure they could use that. We could also utilize carbon capture. We've mentioned that. There's CO2 oil-enhanced recovery occurring just south of the Colstrip facility down in the Broadus area. So it seems to me we could negotiate or counter to the EPA and say, hey, we've got a great way to bring about the change you guys are asking, but we're going to do it in a much different way, a much more practical manner, and we think the results are going to be even better than what you're trying to force on us with the final rule. So with that, we got 2 minutes. Am I crazy? Is that just financially outrageous? And if that's financially outrageous, what are some of these other changes we were talking about going to cost us? Mike, I'll tee it up to you first.
Well, I'll be quick since we have little time and we want to get down to the panel, through the panel. I guess the key there, I think, Commissioner Bushman, is collaboration. What you've talked about there is something that would have a lot of appeal, I think, and would be good for Montana, but we'd have to understand how it would be paid for is your key question. I can't answer that. I don't know how we'd actually do that, but it would be have to be a very collaborative effort.
Dennis, your opinion?
Well, I would agree. Colstrip and the resources that are here in Montana really have been historically regional resources, and we're at our best as a region when we're working together to try to solve these issues. And I do believe we could do a bit better job of that right now. But specifically, what some of the things that you mentioned, it seems like a tall hill to climb right now, but it's worth the effort. It really is.
Very good. Carl, your take on that?
Just this, I mean, regardless of how we're going to move, I think things are moving, and that means we're going to have to build some new equipment, put new steel in the ground, and that's more costly than running the stuff that we've been running and have depreciated. So it's just a matter, I think the communication and the collaboration does allow us to be efficient and try to get to a good place as smartly as we can.
Well, I think the key is transmission and how do you pay for it. You don't pay for it in a 5-year payback. None of the big transmission lines have ever been built that way. So we need to have programs, particularly federal structured programs with taxes and other things that help build these great interstate transmission lines that are needed to make our system more reliable and more robust. And that is going to be the key to the future energy market. If you can't ship gas to the Marcellus Basin in Pennsylvania because it can't compete with that, but you might be able to compete by shipping electricity into the Midwest and the East, balanced with gas generated in the state of Montana.
Very good. Gentlemen, thank you very much for participating today. Senator Daines, thank you very much for having us.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the insights there. Got a lot of smart people here thinking about how to solve these problems here in Montana. I'm going to ask Brian Brown on behalf of the Billings Chamber of Commerce to make an announcement before we wrap up.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Brian Brown, and I am with First Interstate Bank, and First Interstate Bank is a proud sponsor of this year's Montana Energy Summit, so thank you. I'm also an executive committee member on the Billings Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. And I'd like to invite you to join 1,600 attendees tomorrow at the annual Billings Chamber Breakfast at Metro Park. It's from 7 to 9 a.m. Doors open at 6 a.m., so you can get there pretty early. Special guest speaker is Captain Sully Sullenberger, the pilot that landed on the Hudson, Miracle on the Hudson. You can get tickets by contacting the Chamber of Commerce or Metro Park. Look forward to seeing you there and here tomorrow as well. Thank you.
In fact, I'll be at that breakfast tomorrow. Nothing like hearing from a guy who had to be a quick thinker on his feet after you lose your engines to a bird strike and figure out how to put down a jet on the Hudson without killing anybody. That was impressive. So he'll be the speaker tomorrow. Well, this wraps up our general sessions here today. There are breakout sessions remaining that start at 3:15. There's a total of 12, and these can be for those of you who looking for continuing education credit or CLE credit. They're all credit certified. There's 12 different breakouts that go from 3:15 to 4:15, and then 4:15 to 5:15. And again, take a look at flip the next page of your program. You'll see the seminars that are open here this afternoon. And then tomorrow, we will start here at 9:20 a.m., 9:20, and I'll kick it off then, and then we'll have at 9:30, we'll have Ryan Lance, the CEO of ConocoPhillips, who will be here tomorrow with us. He's also a native Montanan. His mother, in fact, lives here in Billings. It's a real honor to have him join us in the morning. So thanks for a great day. I hope this was helpful. I found it very instructive. I learned a lot, and it tells me once again that the best solutions can be found right here in Montana in terms of collaborating, join forces here with our academic institutions, with the research, with government and the policymakers, as well as with industry. And I think we can come up with something here that can solve the problems. And truly, I'm optimistic about the future of energy in Montana with all the smart people that have been here today and the collaborations going on already. So we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:20 a.m. right here. Have a good night.